Thank you, Commissioner Talent, Commissioner Goodwin, for providing me the opportunity to testify today on the precarious state of deterrence across the Taiwan Strait. All the views I am going to express today are my own and do not represent those of any of the institutions with which I am affiliated or have been affiliated. My bottom line assessment is that cross-strait deterrence is arguably weaker than at any point since the Korean War. Impressive military modernization on the part of China, U.S. failure to build robust coalitions to counter Chinese regional aggression, and Xi Jinping's personal ambition all have coalesced to create a situation for Beijing in which the benefits of using force more and more are becoming so high that they outweigh the costs. The first issue I want to address is the conditions under which Chinese leaders would then initiate a conflict over Taiwan. I think it's relatively uncontroversial to say if Taiwan were to do something like declare independence, China would use force to reverse that decision at the very least, and probably even push for unification once it used force to reverse that decision. So this idea that a policy or an action taken by Taipei or even the United States could potentially precipitate a conflict has been the main concern, I think, for the past 2 decades. But the situation has changed. I believe the greatest threat now is that Beijing will launch a military operation to force, quote, reunification, in their words, irrespective of Washington or Taipei's policies or actions. So the good news of this is I think that Beijing is waiting for the most favorable moment and thus will not be pushed by smaller slights such as U.S. visits or arms sales before it makes a move. It will only make a move when it's ready. So, unless Beijing is ready to take Taiwan by force, its leadership is going to carefully calibrate any responses to other U.S. or Taiwan actions as long as those aren't independence, and they will try not to escalate to war. The bad news is that when Xi Jinping is confident that his military can win that war across the strait, I think he's going to go for it. So, what determines whether or not he's confident? It's hard to say what his assessment of current military capabilities are. In my testimony, I lay out some of the key components of Chinese military modernization program up to today. But the bottom line is their main goal has been to develop the capability to conduct joint operations, precisely the type of joint operation needed to launch an amphibious assault against Taiwan. And a key part of that program was just completed last year. And a spokesperson for Chinese Ministry of National Defense has said that they have basically completed these national defense and military reforms. We also know that just in November, they revised their strategic guidelines for only the fifth time in history to incorporate their new focus on joint operations. So more and more, it seems that there is this increasing confidence that they could do it. And it's not only Chinese thinkers, it's also the United States and people in the United States that think that a potential clash between the United States and China over Taiwan could likely result in a U.S. defeat. With China completing, in the words of a RAND study, they could complete an all out invasion in, quote, a finite time period measured in days, not weeks. Chinese strategists do recognize the United States' vast military capabilities, but their conventional wisdom is that because of China's proximity to Taiwan, their corresponding access to operational resources, and how resolute they are, the relative balance, the local balance of power has shifted in China's favor. So for the bottom line is for the first time in history, Xi Jinping is going to have at his disposal a military capable of forcing unification. So while many Western observers, like myself, think that they might be able to do so in about 5 years, Chinese military leaders have told me personally they think they'll be ready in a year or two. So this doesn't mean I think they're going to go for this now. Um, I think what it means is that they're going to want to conduct more and more realistic and joint operational exercises, put their capabilities to the test, and then in a couple of years, when they're confident, then they'll do it. So one of the things is, in this hypothetical scenario, what can the United States do? Well, first and foremost, I think deterrence by increasing the costs to Beijing is unlikely to work. Deterrence by denial is really only the way forward. I believe if you told Xi Jinping that he could have Taiwan, but he would lose his navy, he would still go for it. So deterrence by denial means the United States military can physically stop them from doing this. And that would have the hugest impact on Chinese thinking. Obviously, if the United States could also put together a coalition that was not only short term for the Taiwan contingency, but if Beijing thought an attack on Taiwan meant that there'd be a countervailing coalition of U.S. and U.S. allies that would contain its rise for the long term, they would also think those costs too high. I think those two scenarios in the short term are relatively unlikely, unfortunately. And so right now what people focus on is U.S. resolve and how to signal resolve. The problem is that U.S. resolve and what we say about what we're willing to do with Taiwan can often work at cross purposes with deterrence. In a hypothetical conflict over Taiwan, how China escalates force is most dependent on this expectation of U.S. involvement, but not in the way we think. If China doesn't expect U.S. resolve to intervene, and then the United States doesn't directly support Taiwan, I think we'll see China pursuing a graduated military approach. They'll start with lower level attacks, maybe missile attacks, maybe a partial blockade, and only move to an amphibious attack if Taiwan doesn't capitulate. If, on the other hand, they do expect U.S. intervention because U.S. efforts to signal our resolve have been so successful, I think Beijing goes to the highest level of violence as quickly as possible to try to accomplish a fait accompli before the United States intervenes. This could even include Chinese attacks on U.S. bases in the region. In my testimony, I outline more the reasons why I think the Chinese leadership is pessimistic about the prospects of peaceful reunification. Polling in China, as well as numerous speeches by Xi Jinping, suggests that both Xi Jinping and the Chinese public are growing more and more impatient. I think this is why he has said he doesn't want to pass down the issue generation to generation, and he's likely to move to fully resolve it during his tenure. So what are some of the recommendations that I would make given this bleak picture? U.S. policy needs to focus on shaping Chinese perceptions about their ability to successfully absorb Taiwan through military means. This means that changes need to be mainly made to U.S. Military capabilities, not to U.S. policy. Any move to end strategic ambiguity, as some have argued, I do not think will enhance cross-strait deterrence and actually might make it even more difficult for the United States to defend Taiwan. We need significant changes in U.S. capabilities that focus on intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities to ensure the United States gets adequate warning of an impending Chinese attack, to increase U.S. resiliency in the region and augment firepower in the Strait. Lastly, on firepower, I really do believe that if China launches an attack, they've considered all costs. It has considered the possibility of U.S. intervention. So the only thing that prevents China from absorbing Taiwan is brute force. This means things like pre-positioning networks of missile launchers and armed drones near Taiwan and dispersing U.S. force posture through, I would say, smaller islands as well as through the first and second island chain. The last 2 points I'll make on recommendations is I think it's important to improve Taiwan capabilities, but we have to keep in mind that this buys the United States time, nothing else. Taiwan is never going to be able to defend itself alone against mainland China, even with all the asymmetric capability in the world. And the last point is I think we should ask the Congressional Research Service to conduct a study of U.S. war termination behavior. The focus of my testimony has been on political and strategic factors influencing Chinese decision-making. But I think one of the main issues is that the United States has a historical tendency towards mission creep and maximalist demands. If we find ourselves in a conflict, the United States might not be willing to go to the pre-war status quo and might demand, for example, Taiwan independence once blood and treasure had been lost. This is exactly the type of scenario that could lead to escalations to levels of violence the United States is not willing to absorb, including nuclear conflict. Thank you.